Should I just stay in my home? Pros and cons of aging in place. There was a survey done just a few years ago by Merrill Lynch in conjunction with a group called AgeWave. And they asked retirees 65 and older, what are some of the biggest concerns that you have about living a long lifetime? And of course, you know, generally speaking, living a long lifetime is considered to be a good thing. But obviously there are some concerns that come along with that. As people live longer, there are, as you see here, the number one concern is serious health problems at 72%. Followed by, at 60%, not being a burden on my family. And as you can see, running out of money to live comfortably, almost half of the respondees. But then being lonely, not having a purpose, finally having nothing to leave the children or grandchildren. So I was in the financial planning business for 13 years before starting mylifesite.net. And, you know, when you're in the financial planning business, so much about the money. That's our job as financial planners, and we focus on asset allocation and rate of returns and things of this nature. But what I see when I look at this, what really stands out is that 4 of the 6 responses really don't have that much to do with money, at least not directly. And the interesting thing is that those 4 in particular are impacted in a pretty dramatic way by where someone lives as they transition through the different stages of retirement, from the early to mid to later stages of retirement. So Yogi Berra once said, if you don't know where you're going, you'll end up someplace else. And I think that's a good segue into what we're going to talk about today, because it really is about, you know, where does one go from here? What's the best retirement lifestyle or the best retirement living situation for somebody, you know, depending on their particular circumstances. So when we talk about planning for long-term housing and care, there's really, in my mind, one overarching goal, and that is to help make sure that that transition from independent living to living with care services, whenever that time comes, is as manageable and life-affirming as possible. Now, whenever that time comes, you know, for some, if somebody who's, say, in their early to mid-70s, for instance, it could be years. It could be 20 or 30 years or longer before they ever need care, if at all. For others, it certainly could happen sooner than that. So it's really about planning ahead and making sure that you and your family members have had these important discussions, and to the extent possible, know sort of how you would want things to be handled if and when that time comes. So what are the retirement living choices? Well, there's really 2 overarching choices. The first, of course, is to stay in your home. And that's really what we're going to talk about today, obviously. The vast majority of people want to stay in their homes. So we're going to talk about some of the reasons why, and then we'll look at the other side of that as well, some of the drawbacks to that. The alternative, of course, is moving into a retirement community, or at least moving to some type of a community setting. So there's different categories perhaps under that, but at the end of the day, you can either stay where you are or move to a community setting. I was doing a presentation not too long ago, a live presentation, and somebody said I forgot one, and when I asked them what it was, they said moving in with the children. And it always got a, you know, it seems to get a chuckle, or sometimes when I mention that, moans and groans even. So I don't know, apparently that's not something a lot of people want to do, even though decades ago that was just kind of what happened. So we're not going to focus much on retirement communities today. We'll talk about that in upcoming presentations, but let's talk a little bit more about staying in the home. So here are some of the main reasons that people generally want to stay in their home. Obviously, it's a comfortable and familiar environment. We tend to be, we kind of stick to what we know. A lot of times we are creatures of habit and really don't like change. And so a lot of times people just simply find that they would prefer to stay in a place that's comfortable and familiar to them. Of course, you also have that emotional connection. If you're still living in a home that you've been in for years and years, perhaps it's the home that you raised your children in, and even grandchildren, spent a lot of time there, and you just have that that emotional tie that sometimes is tough to break away from, and that you want to that you want to hold on to and maintain as long as possible. So certainly an understandable reason. Neighbors. You know, one of the things I hear a lot is we have good neighbors. Our neighbors have been around for a long time, and we don't want to leave the neighborhood. And that is true. However, in some cases, you know, the neighborhoods change. As one ages, people do move out, move to be closer to their children or grandchildren or what have you, and turnover starts to take place. So a lot of times the neighborhood simply is not what it was years and years ago. And so sometimes that's not the case, but many times people do want to stick close to the neighbors that they have good relationships with. A biggie, avoids the hassle of moving. I have talked with so many people who say, you know what, we're not going to move, even if that makes more sense for them, because we just don't want to deal with all of our stuff. And so, you know, clutter that's accumulated over the years and what to do with that. And so we'll talk a little bit about the other side of this later, but certainly for many people, they just simply don't want to deal with the hassle of moving. Less expensive. I have maybe out to the side because that's not necessarily always the case. Many times it is, particularly when we're talking about independent living. If your home is paid off and you know, you don't have that mortgage payment, then certainly living in your home may be less expensive than a retirement community. However, if you at some point do require care services and so forth, it's, you know, it all depends on whether or not living in your home is still less expensive. So that one's not so black and white, but certainly there's a perception, and oftentimes, again, during independent living, it's reality that sure, it can be less expensive to stay in your home. Lower exposure to illness. When I say this, I mean this compared to, again, a retirement community type of setting where, you know, anytime you're living in a group setting, the spread of flu-like illness and so forth can certainly take place, whereas if you're living in your own home, you know, you just maybe don't have that same exposure. So it's not something that I see happening a lot, but every now and again you do hear a story where a retirement community has an illness that's affected a number of their residents and things like that, and they have to take added precautions and so forth. And then finally, and I saved this one last on purpose, is independence. That's probably the most popular answer I get when I say, what does staying in the home mean to you? And I'll hear independence. And you'll notice what I've put here is sense of independence, because in many cases, staying at home isn't necessarily a more independent situation, even though perception-wise, that's just what people often think. So we want to talk a little bit more about that. I would like to point out that wanting to stay in the home does not always necessarily mean that one should stay in the home. Again, everybody's situation is different, and you've got to ultimately decide what's best for you based on many of the things that we're going to talk about in this presentation. But it is important, I think, to draw that distinction that wanting to stay in the home does not necessarily mean that one should. A lot of those reasons we just went over are really emotional-based reasons, and emotions are important. You need to be happy and feel good about where you live, particularly as you go through those different stages of retirement. But it's also really important to think about the practical or impractical aspects of that decision as well. And that point is sort of highlighted by a number of articles that I've seen recently. This is one in particular in the New York Times. And the title really stood out to me, where it said, "At home, many seniors are imprisoned by their independence." And it really talked about that idea that many times those who stay in their home seeking independence actually end up with less independence. And so it's something that people really need to think about. And I'm starting to see kind of an awakening, if you will, where studies are showing that, you know what, staying in the home, while it still may make sense for a lot of people, there are some that actually it doesn't make as much sense for. And one other thing to point out is this book that was written I believe it was last year, yes, March of last year, by a professor of gerontology at the University of Florida. And the title of the book was Aging in the Right Place, kind of a play on the phrase of aging in place. But the whole point of his book was kind of summed up in this quote, where he said the concept of aging in place has become a mantra in recent years that might prevent older adults from seeking healthier and more holistic alternatives. So again, just reiterating that point that there's more and more research showing that living at home isn't always the best solution for people. So that's a transition, I guess, into what we're going to talk about now, which is kind of the flip side of this. Let's talk about some of the possible implications, negative implications of staying in the home. Well, the first, maybe the most obvious, would be the potential for home modifications. Now, that's not necessarily a negative thing. It just depends on the build out of somebody's home, where the bedroom is, whether there's stairs, the width of the hallways, height of the cabinets, and all these types of things. And so modifications may be needed at some point. They may be moderate or perhaps more extensive. I read an article just recently where a financial advisor said that he spent upwards of $200,000 modifying his mother's home so that she could stay there you know, as she aged. And ultimately what happened is, I can't remember if she just fell ill or suffered from a physical fall, but she had to end up moving out to a care facility, rather expensive care facility anyways. And so on top of the $200,000, she wasn't able to stay home after all and had to move and pay that additional expense on top of it. So anyway, home modifications could potentially be one thing that would need to be done. Interior and exterior maintenance, a lot of times people, when I do visit a retirement community, I'll ask somebody, you know, what's one of the reasons you chose to move here? One of the things I'll often hear is, we just got tired of taking care of the home. You know, we just want to be somewhere where the maintenance is taken care of for us, the laundry, you know, housekeeping. We don't have the lawn to take care of like we used to. Some retirement communities do still offer villas and you have your own lawn, but even then it's taken care of by staff and so forth. So, you know, maintenance of the home, taking care of the yard, replacing the roof, HVAC, whatever it is, can be an impediment over time, particularly if somebody's mobility becomes less. Transportation and travel limitations. You know, when we talk about transportation, and this I think points really to this notion of independence, if somebody reaches the point where they're no longer able to drive themselves safely, that of course is a very difficult situation, because that is obviously one of the last things when we talk about independence, having to give up the keys, so to speak. But when that occurs, it really does lead to a less independent situation. And for those who live at home, particularly if they're single, it can become a very confining situation. And so, you know, you have that lack of interaction, social interaction, and things of that nature. And so that leads to the next one here, which is risk of social isolation. There are more and more studies that we're seeing that point to the health risk of social isolation. And I don't want to imply that living at home automatically means somebody's going to be socially isolated, you know, but the reality is that as time goes on, and again, as mobility becomes, you know, as they have less mobility and less interaction, you do start to see that, and it can really have an impact on somebody's health, their mental health as well as their physical health. People who are lonely, if you will, tend to have higher risk of heart problems and high blood pressure, insomnia, and things of this nature. Lack of nutrition, that's something else that we're starting to see more of, you know, in terms of some research that's out there or articles that, you know, those who live at home, as they're less able to prepare meals for themselves or have access to regular meals, you know, they have irregular meal times or poor nutrition, just really not receiving the type of 3 balanced meals a day that they should. And of course that, on top of the other things that we're talking about, also can lead to illness and really chronic poor health conditions. So As I said before, this doesn't necessarily mean that that's going to be the case for everyone, but it's something to think about. If somebody ages in their own home, how are they going to continue to receive those 3 balanced meals each day? Challenges of in-home care. There are certainly some wonderful in-home care service providers out there. People who are in that profession are amazing because of what they do and their hearts for what they do. But at the same time, there's some real challenges in that industry, and probably the biggest is finding consistent quality care. There's just a lot of turnover. And that for many people is a challenge. So somebody has to manage that process, and it's typically not the person receiving the care. So if that point comes where somebody needs some care in their home, whether it's just a couple hours a day or higher levels of care, that's a process that can really become challenging. Somebody can have all their financial affairs in order or have long-term care insurance and or have a high level of assets, but still at the end of the day, if they're not able to find good quality care, it can become very problematic. Delaying a move until later. Sometimes what I'll see is people want to stay in their home as long as possible, as we've talked about, for all the reasons I showed earlier. But then at some point they end up having to move anyway, just simply because it's no longer safe to live in the home. And the challenge with that is that they've delayed that move to a point in time where it's very difficult from a physical and a health standpoint, emotionally, mentally, and even physically. The longer somebody delays a move, the more difficult that move can be on somebody's, on their body, frankly, and their mind and their emotions and everything else. And so that often can be a challenge, and that's particularly an issue when you have spouses. If there's 2 spouses, one requires care outside of the home, the other still living in the home, then you have that separation taking place in many cases. And then finally, the potential burden on family. This is something I want to jump into just for a few minutes here before we close, because I think it's really important to take this into consideration. The vast majority of caregiving provided in this country is done so by family members. I think it's upwards of 90% of caregiving is provided by an unpaid family caregiver. And there's 65 million unpaid family caregivers in this country. Not all are caring for an older adult, but most of them are. The estimated economic value of unpaid caregivers in this country is $450 billion per year. 17% of caregivers feel their health is worse as a result of serving in that role. If any of you have served in that role, you can relate to some of this, I know. Up to 70% have clinically significant symptoms of depression, which of course can lead to other health problems. 50% say caregiving takes time away from friends and family members. And lastly, and this one's pretty staggering, the average lost lifetime wages and benefits for the family caregiver is almost $304,000. And so somebody might say, well, how is that the case? Well, what happens is usually when somebody's serving in that role, they have to take time away from their careers, often even retiring earlier than had planned. And so that's a loss of wages, but it also translates to a couple of other things. Number one, less that person can contribute to their retirement account. Because if I'm earning less, that's less I can contribute. And then also it can impact the caregiver's calculation for Social Security. And so when you take the present value of those future income streams, the average comes to about $304,000. And the reason I think this is important is because a lot of times people will say, well, I'll stay in my home, it'll be a lot cheaper to do that. That may be the case directly, but what you'll see here is indirectly, a lot of times that cost gets passed on to the next generation. So, this is not to suggest that most of us would not do, we'd do anything for our loved ones and our parents and so forth. But the issue is that it does have a pretty dramatic impact. And so I know there's a growing number of people who say, I simply don't want to put my children or even my grandchildren through what I had to go through. So anyway, when you talk about the impact on health and so forth, and then this financial impact, it can really put a burden on a family. So in closing, the idea really, as I said, is what's best for you or your loved one. There's no clear-cut answer. There are a lot of really good reasons to stay in the home, but as I mentioned, a lot of them, again, are emotional based. So you really need to think through this other side, whether you're planning for yourself or a loved one or a client. Really take all these things into consideration, and to the extent possible, have a plan in place. So we're going to do some upcoming, we'll have more webinars coming up. Hopefully you've seen those as you signed up for this one. If not, you'll receive an email following this webinar with a link to those so you can sign up. But we're going to talk more about, what are some of the other retirement living options out there. The senior living landscape, as you will, what the different options are, what types of questions to ask, and things of that nature. And so that concludes our webinar today. I want to thank you all again for attending. You see our websites there at the bottom, mylifesite.net and nacra.com. You can go to either one of those websites or both to get a lot of other additional really good information on senior living. And with that, I am going to close. Again, thank you all for attending, and I hope you have a wonderful day.